mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions. But before we begin and before I introduce the guests, can we just go through some formal business of this panel that we just need to deal with? So can I begin with item 1, apologies for absence. I've got no chair's announcements. Have we got any apologies?
Yes, apologies have been received from Assembly Member Whittle and Assembly Member Bacon.
Okay, let's move in then on declarations of interest. We can note the declaration of interest listed on the agendas. Are there any members who wish to make any specific declarations?
No.
Okay, moving on to 3, can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 28th of November 2018 to be signed off by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
And item 4, summary list of actions. Can we note and complete the outstanding actions and additional correspondence?
Agreed.
Okay, let's move to our main business then on item 5. And can I welcome our guests to this session? So Dr. Fiona Twycross, Assembly Member, but also Chair of the London Resilience Forum. Deputy, you also have another title that I should know, but you just want to remind me.
Amplifying Resilience.
Thank you very much. And John Hetherington, Head of the London Resilience Team. Is that right? Correct?
Yes.
Yep. And then also, can we welcome Kadir Mir, Chief Operating Officer from the NHS England in London, as well as your colleague Peter Borman, Regional Head of Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response, NHS England. So can I welcome you? Just before, so we did have a previous meeting back in November. We spoke to, I think, your colleague Fiona, who's the Vice Chair of the Forum, and we talked about the issue of the government saying, thank you very much, we'd like you to start preparing for this. You had a number of papers before you. I think there were various degrees of, how can I say, helpfulness in terms of being to prepare, but there was also a number of grey areas in terms of where you're being prepared. And I think at the same time that we in London and the various sectors like London local government have been told that the NHS were also told to start preparing for various issues, and particularly around no deal. I just thought just for a scene setting of the issues, since that meeting with John Barradell, I think the forum met and your sectors come to a view and formally made a statement generally about where things were. And you may wish to correct me, but we think in terms of your report following that meeting of your of those who are preparing for London's resilience, that you came to the conclusions and the following key points: that the technical notice and details of the government's preparations published by central government, whilst helpful for some sector-specific issues, do not alone contain sufficient information to inform contingency planning. That the comprehensive assessments of the implications of the critical supply chains and personnel needed to be conducted by partnership organisations where they have not been yet fully considered. I think you'll go on to do that. Partners are generally confident in their ability to implement adequate contingency plans for Brexit and in the partnership's capability to respond to specific risks, such as the increased protest activity and the potential for civil unrest. These issues considered to be within the partners' extended emergency response capabilities. However, there is a gap of information, presumably that's from government, about potential risks that may require partnerships to respond to an emergency, including to a need to develop detailed planning assumptions. For examples, residual risk following central government's mitigation of disruption of food, energy, fuel supplies, borders, people and goods, and that the information received on the technical notices today does not indicate significant concerns in the areas of energy and fuel supplies, but there remains uncertainty about implications for food supplies and border disruption. Is that still the case, or have things moved on since you issued that report from your forum?
Well, unfortunately, I think that is still the case. I think that we have had quite a lot of engagement with government, but I don't feel that I think the planning assumptions may have been modified very slightly since then, but they still lack any sort of detail or underlying explanation about what lies beneath the assumptions that we're being asked to work to. We've raised on 2 occasions, we've sent quite detailed lists of issues that would require or feel that we quite urgently need additional information from the government. And actually it still feels like the Resilience Forum partners are reporting this as well, and other organisations reporting that feels like there's quite a one-way stream often into government, and there's very little forthcoming back that is useful. So I think with the planning assumptions, one of the issues has been that there's still a reluctance for us to share those with key partners. I think it's 44 days now. It's very close now. We're still being asked to avoid sharing the planning assumptions. That leads to a belief by people who aren't seeing the planning assumptions that there's some sort of holy grail that will give the key to things, and that's not the case. And I think that we do need to actually see some of the detail and get a stronger understanding of some of the underlying assumptions behind the underlying reasons behind some of the planning assumptions. So it doesn't feel like we're getting sufficient information out of government yet. And I think part of that is because of the chaotic situation we see the government in. So you see the paralysis at a national level in terms of parliamentary activity. Every week it feels like we're offered a possible solution this week, and then this week it feels like people are starting to change the narrative a bit to make it clear that it might go right to the wire. And if we're not going to get any additional information out of government in any sort of detail until there is a parliamentary conclusion, that presents a big risk, because it means that we are not working to the maximum level of information we might do.
So 44 days out, so the gaps still exist in information that were originally outlined. I think you were looking for more information around some of the technical notes around food supply, border disruption, and issues of energy and fuel. Yeah. Was that still exists?
Yeah, I think we've done some work around this anyway, because I think what we haven't been prepared to do is sort of wait for information to be forthcoming. So particularly on the issue of food, we're very fortunate in London to have the London Food Board. So we've got a subgroup between the Resilience Forum and the Food Board that has been digging down into some of the issues that might arise around food in the context of a no-deal Brexit.
And so I'm right in thinking we're still working at a strategic level on the brief that you were given towards the end of last summer that slightly developed over that period of time leading up to the Christmas period, in the technical notes that you were provided, or the limited
the technical notes. I think
unless there's something
no, we haven't had more than the technical notes really.
Nor any clear directive as to what we should be planning for. I think it's left to interpretation. But as the Deputy Mayor said, we're getting, I'm not saying it's the answer, but we're getting an answer rather than the working out. And that's the bit that we need to understand. Otherwise, we'll be solving consequences, not root problems. So it leaves us in a position where we're unable to put any detailed plan or understand what the government contingency plans are so that we can respond accordingly.
Not that I'm an apologist for government, but I suppose given the period of time last year, and maybe if we can talk about optimism in this process, they were planning for contingencies. But are you do you believe in the coming next 20 odd days that you're going to get some further information, or where government might direct you or say they're particularly concerned about this? Because presumably government is receiving information not just from this region and from others, and I presume that your colleagues outside London will be saying virtually the same things, because we're all working within a very limited focus.
I think so. I think we are fortunate in London that we have a London Resilience Group that has the capacity, and we're increasing the capacity to do this work. My concern is that in some other areas people have been waiting until they get a stronger indication from government, whereas we've been treating the planning assumptions like a cryptic crossword, and actually sort of picking them apart and trying to understand what might be behind the planning assumptions. We've got a few events coming up that we're hoping will provide more answers. So we're meeting, we've got a meeting with MHCLG officials tomorrow. We're going to a full-day event for resilience forums in the southeast on Friday, and then in the beginning of March there's a one-day conference for LRF chairs that will focus specifically on Brexit. But I think that one of the issues, I think the day before John Barrett and John Hetherington came to see you last time, we'd had a LRF conference, I think, for the chairs. And I think that one of the regrettable things is that opportunities like that have been missed in terms of early interventions and early provision of advice, because I think there's been a reluctance to go away from the government's insistence for too long that actually they really were confident of getting a deal. So we're shifting into this acceptance that we are closer to a no-deal situation at this point, whereas if there'd been a clear indication from government at an earlier stage, it would have allowed people to have that confidence to start actually doing that detailed planning. In terms of planning for what could, I mean, we also don't know what could happen or would happen exactly. We can make educated assessments of what we think might happen in the case of a no-deal judgment, but what you would normally get, so for example for Y2K and for the Olympics, you had a much greater running time where people were very open about the need to undertake proper contingency planning. And so actually you can also see that not so much in London but in other parts of the country people have been really waiting for that certainty, and actually it's been irresponsible of government to have that message going through, because it has discouraged some areas to undertake the level of contingency planning. They have taken as read that actually the government is confident of having a deal, and it's now getting a bit too late and everybody's sort of having to play a game of catch up. So we are hopeful again that we might get more information at these two events, and we will get more information, but on the evidence of what we've had so far, it's been pretty limited.
And of course your key government department that you normally liaise with on resilience issue is the Cabinet Office, is that correct? Or is that
the Cabinet Office do contingency planning, but our main contact would be MHCLG through the Red Team.
Sorry, the
Resilience and Emergencies Division.
Right, through the Cabinet Office?
It's MHCLG.
Oh, it's CLG. And really, I suppose, just my last point in just setting this scene at national level, is there consistency in government messages coming back and what's coming out to different people? Because, you know, some of this work originally came out through the linked Treasury paper, Operation whatever we called it, this week, around that. Is there a consistency in those messages, even though you could do with more information and more you know, assumptions of what government is thinking will happen? Is there consistency in messages coming from across the department?
I mean, my view would be that government is fairly chaotic at the moment. I think that I would say this is probably the biggest constitutional crisis any of us will hopefully witness in our lifetime. We do sometimes get contradictory messages out of government, but the main issue, in my view, is a lack of information, not contradictory information. And in some ways it would be helpful if people got their contradictory statements out, because then we'd at least have more than we do at the moment.
Okay, at this point I want to bring in our NHS colleagues, and the reason why you're here, because we think you're one of the key sectors in London that where I think it's fair to say that you're stressed at various times of the year, more so than others, and this may compound the stress and the challenges you face in delivering the services that you want to deliver to London's communities. So in the sense that you've heard some of the questions I had, and I think when we last had John Barradell, we sort of teased out of him that even though the NHS had been given their instructions to operate, but of course, partly because the nature of the conversation were not, that you weren't able to fully engage with other partners you had to do it yourself first before you can engage with others and share what you would normally do in resilience type operations. Is that still fair to say? And no doubt that's changed now because you're some way ahead of some of those preparations. Is that correct? So you initially had to start in your own area and then engage with others of the resilience family of people that may help you in tackling these challenges.
So first of all, thank you for inviting us to speak. Very happy to be here. I'm very happy because we work very closely with the London Resilience Forum and with Fiona and her team and John. In relation to our preparations, so where does the NHS start? Well, we're used to managing we're used to planning for every eventuality. We're used to managing and preparing for various major incidents or potential issues of concern. So we've had cyber, we've had terrorism, we've had cyber terrorism, we had Grenfell, etc. So we've got a level of experience and good partnership working across London really, and we're and a stable team and a stable set of stakeholders. So I think Fiona's right. In the first instance, there's a strong partnership in London and across its organisations, but also its geography, that enable us to work, I think, much more coherently than other parts of the country might be able to. So I think that's a starting point for us. Secondly, I think in relation to the specifics of your question, we have got clear guidance, and that guidance is not prohibitive or restrictive in our ability, I think, to work with our partners. Or certainly I don't feel that. I'll test that with Peter, who works at a more operational level. So we in London have got a set of guidance from the Department of Health in terms of their expectations of NHS England, and NHS England national colleagues have set out their expectations for us in London. So in response to that, we have established a regional operational group that's brought together partners from across health and social care. So we've established a regional forum to do that, so making sure that we're working across health and local government. And we've also established a stakeholder group. So we're meeting on a weekly basis. We're meeting on a weekly basis as a team to go through our preparations and working through the latest bit of guidance and expectations. We've got a fortnightly meeting of the partnership forum across the NHS and social care colleagues, including public health. And on a fortnightly basis, we also hold a stakeholder call where we have representatives from all the acute trusts, all the hospitals, all the commissioners, all the CCGs, where we go through the latest update on preparations and make sure that everybody's on the same page and is clear about the expectations. So in answer to your question, I think we've got a clear set of guidance, clear set of expectations. We're working through, it's quite a hierarchical service, the NHS, so DH to national colleagues and national colleagues to us in London. But when we do get to London, I think we are hopefully working in a partnership, through the partnership of the London Resilience Forum. The final bit to say is we've got a conference tomorrow where we've got around 150 participants from across health and social care, where we are going through our preparations and our plans and making sure that we are answering and addressing any concerns being raised. I think it's at the same time as the LRF, so
there's some nickel.
So one of us will be here and one of us will be there.
And to be fair, I mean, most of the general public will just think hospitals, but of course it's not. It's GP services, it's those that are cared at home, it's their drug supply, it's their equipment that you need to do. So is your primary focus is it hierarchical? What's the first things you've had to deal with at the different levels of degrees of protections or minimising disruption in the event of no deal?
I think it's a really good question, and I think when we've worked through the expectations or any of the potential issues, the immediate concerns or issues with any potential no deal scenario is supply chain. So that's where we are focusing our energy and effort. It's any the implications or any potential implications from an impact on supply chain. Supply chain in terms of medicines and supply chains in terms of non-medical. And we have to work through those at every level. So it's supply chain for medicines and non-medical kind of supplies within hospitals. The same within community and general practice, and the same within pharmacy and social care. So I wouldn't say that we are prioritising any one level of provision above other, but it is about understanding the impact and planning and preparing for it. So it'll be different medicines. So for acute trusts it'll be, and for pharmacies, or for acute trusts it will be prescribed medicines, and those licensed. For us pharmacies it'll be over the counter, and similarly around non-medical supplies.
And just in going further, so even though the pressure's on you, it's almost the pressure is also on your suppliers, isn't it? It's not you that have got a stockpile, albeit that you might. You'll be asking them maybe about their delivery arrangements to give you more time in terms to allow for those deliveries wherever they're coming from outside the UK in that sense. And does that go the same for not just the delivery of issues, but the stockpiling of drugs? Because they have a shelf life, don't they, drugs?
They do.
Best Buy and all the rest of it. There's only so much you can do.
They do. So we're really sensitive about the suggestion of stockpiling and any suggestion to encourage that kind of. So the advice from the department and from NHS England is we are not expecting local pharmacists, general practitioners or hospitals, acute trusts to be stockpiling. Yeah? There's national preparations and agreements with all our major suppliers in relation to medicines specifically, in order to make sure that there's contingency. And we're planning on, the national colleagues are planning on a 6-week contingency in order to ameliorate and address any slowing up of supplies from the continent or beyond. So we've got really clear messages: no stockpiling, because that by its very nature could cause for us a run on supplies.
Yeah. And then just on another aspect of this, so of course in the run up to Brexit, people's anxiety about their own situation. You're a large employer, number of EU nationals there. You would have seen some change already in terms of people making some choices about their future, whether they stay or seek to stay here or go because they've got expertise that's transferable throughout the world in some cases. What, in the event of no deal, what is your planning assumptions around that, and how that will impact on services? And is that, I presume it's again throughout the NHS system, not just in terms of acute hospitals in that sense, but tell us what you're thinking is that and what steps you're taking around that.
So, Health Education England colleagues have done some analysis around workforce implications, and what's clear from that, from our perspective, is that we're not expecting any immediate impact in relation to workforce issues for the NHS. Our focus will remain on supply chain in relation to a no deal. There is a potential, and there is a potential, and I think social care colleagues or local government colleagues would potentially have more concern in relation to the impact on social care, because of the fragility potentially of that workforce compared to the potentially higher qualified and more stable workforce that the NHS may well have within doctors and nurses, etc. So there's a challenge there that I wouldn't have the detail on. But in terms of our expectations around EU nationals within the service, most NHS England and most of the NHS now is doing quite a lot of work in terms of engaging its workforce, making sure that we're supporting them in terms of the application in order to I've lost the word for the term, in order to settle status. NHS England before that was waived, and by government had already committed to waive any associate administration fees, and is looking to support both NHS England staff, but more importantly the wider workforce of the NHS in relation to applying and securing that settled status. We do have some figures. I don't have them to hand that we can share with you. We can share with you post this meeting around some of the analysis that Health Education has done around the potential medium-term impact that we need to be thinking through. But it's something we're sighted on. It's something we're attuned to. It's not our first priority. The priority is around resilience in relation to the supply chain. But the medium-term impact is being thought through. And the work that we need to do there is around the comms, the engagement, making sure that people feel, our workforce feels valued, supported, and that we are lifting any burden around any potential implications around the administration of their status in that process.
Now, of course, you mentioned this complex jigsaw of healthcare provision, social care in that sense. And of course, if one of the worst case scenarios, if it does start to fall back on the local government side, could lead to more pressure being placed on hospitals and issues of that. So in terms of the London setup, how quickly, if you can spot something is going drastically wrong, between a trend starting to happen, that you can quickly rush either to back up or hospitals will change? Because clearly, to create beds now, we'd have to lead to all sorts of things you do during sort of double, I suppose, what you have to do in a winter crisis or the permanent crisis that you have. Is that fair to say? Do you want to just give us a little flavour of those issues?
So the NHS is not short of data, and we're not averse to asking for a template to be completed and some information provided. That comes only too naturally. But in answer to your question, we get daily reports. So on a daily basis, I can tell you, on an unvalidated basis, it's not published data, but on a daily basis, I can tell you the wait for emergency care in any of our hospitals in London. Not only that, I could tell you the length of stay, the average length of stay for a patient in that hospital. I could tell you the level of delayed transfers of care, and if you look at how long patients are waiting, how long they've been in a bed and how long it's taking for them to be discharged, you start to get a very quickly a feel of whether there's an emerging issue or a rising tide, and then you only need to correlate that back to where is that hospital, what are the boroughs that serve that hospital, and what is the potential implications around how well and how resilient the partnership across health and social care is in that borough in relation to that in relation to that hospital. So you can pick those things up very, 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 very quickly across London.
And I presume if you needed to make emergency provision over and above than what you've got, there are plans to do that. Presumably the existing plans for a pandemic would come into play in some cases if it got that bad.
Absolutely. So we've tried and tested plans. You know, I think you mentioned Y2K and the Olympics. I'd put flu pandemic into that, you know, when we prepared for that. And so there's always, every NHS organisation has a business continuity plan. That business continuity plan has scenarios such as flu pandemic. So if there was a flu pandemic, what sort of pressures would that put on services, and what would be our flex in terms of creating the capacity to manage that? So there is capacity across the system. Often the challenge is about when you bring that on, how you might want to use it, and making sure that the financial resources are in place to be able to do that. But within the case of health, quality and safety always comes before any other consideration.
At some stage, someone's going to ask how much this is all costing us, and what diverting you from the day job and everything else. Are people whether it's Fiona or not, because in terms of local government, but yourselves, are you keeping? There will be a cost to your suppliers presume if you're asking to change contracts or the way those contracts are, there's a cost to all this. Are you keeping tabs on that cost?
At the moment, I suppose I think that would probably be a question for National or the department. At the moment, we are working on the basis that every NHS organisation has a team, such as the team that I have, led by Peter, which is an emergency planning, resilience and response team. Alongside that team, we have put some additional resource in place to make sure that there's sufficient capacity to plan and prepare for exiting the EU. So there'll be some administrative costs associated with that. But
usually they come out at the end of your... It's how big your deficit grows, isn't it? In terms that you'd be able to track it through of how that works in the system, wouldn't it? In terms of supplies and issues around that, if you're asking for major changes or
at the moment, I think it's a leading question. At the moment, we're anticipating some minor administrative costs.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we might come back to that. No doubt the Resilience Forum might want to look into that, because I think it's, it's been, and I say that just partly because resilience, I think, has been, we've only really started paying much more attention to resilience type activities. This is clearly a focus of it, but it's always been, I think, a poorer part of service planning, and we need to think about the cost of that and take that into account. Let's move on to our second set of questions.
Yes, so I wanted to look at contingency planning at the London level. So if I could ask Fiona and John, can you set out in a bit more detail for us the work the Resilience Partnership has been doing over the winter to assess the likely impact of a no deal on London? I think you're going to write to government for more information. You've indicated there's not a lot more there. So have you now perhaps drawn up a London risk assessment for Brexit?
Do you want to start with?
Yeah, so as we said, information hasn't been readily forthcoming, but that doesn't mean that we haven't done anything. So we've been working hard, and I think it's also important to note that it's not necessarily the fault of the civil servants who we closely work with. I think they're as exasperated as we are. There is just such a breadth of understanding of the implications, and of course there's four key factors that will affect them out with any of our control. So it's not only what the government policy or preparations are, we also have to contend with what EU mainland will do, and that's a huge impact on the cross-channel supply chain routes. We then have a lot of this sits with individual business and organisations, so certainly the food industry is a multi-billion pound industry that is hugely complex, as we've worked through and found out. And then lastly is the public behaviour, and we just don't know where that's going to go. So in terms of our risk assessment, we have looked at it alongside government. They can refresh theirs in terms of a specific Brexit risk assessment, and we followed the same suit. So we haven't changed our risk assessment per se. Our extant risk assessment stays in place.
It's the same if it's a planned Brexit or a no-deal Brexit.
Yeah, what we've done is to look at the impacts that we'll have and work through those in much more detail, rather than the generic style of risk assessment as to the likelihood of something happening over 5 years. We're looking far more at the impacts rather than generic risks. So as the Deputy Mayor said, we've looked in particular at food and understanding the knock-on implications there, and a great deal of work in conjunction with the Food Board there. We've continued, following the summit that we had in September, we've had a monthly meeting of a Brexit contingency working group, so a subgroup of the LRF, to bring together all the partners to share the understanding of the impact, so that we have a cross-London portfolio of the risks, and that's chaired by the Deputy Mayor. We've written numerous times to the central government, to the Prime Minister, to Minister for Food Security, and await responses, and as we've mentioned earlier, kind of chasing up with MHCLG, just more detailed understanding to have a comprehensive two-way conversation on these risks. And the LRF Chairs Conference that the Deputy Mayor referred to earlier was by and large on our part of lobbying from London that government need to hold on to hold that constructive conference. So that has been positive. In terms of our London work, we take part in all of we try and suck as much back from the government as we can, but we've had to press on with our own arrangements.
Yes.
And at the moment, that's focused on our coordination of London. So as Kadir said earlier, in terms of their ability to spot trends, each organisation is looking at their own way that they're going to spot those impacts and where their adaptations will need to be put in place. And yesterday afternoon we held a workshop of senior stakeholders to agree our coordination arrangements, agree a draft strategy and the terms of reference for the London Strategic Coordinating Group, so that we have that daily ability in the first instances to spot those trends and be able to deal with any of those impacts that arise.
One of the things we've also been very mindful of is that if we entirely focus just on Brexit, we would overlook the fact that in any 1 year London might have a number of independent major incidents. So one of the pieces of work that John and his team are looking at is how we ensure, and this is something that the meeting that John referred to yesterday looked at, how do we make sure that we both address issues that might arise from Brexit alongside how we would manage other incidents that might occur in any sort of normal year. So because I think that in terms of making sure that we can have that strategic coordination in response to any major incident, we've got to recognise that we could have sort of multiple things happening at one time.
Yes, and how you manage that.
Yeah.
So since October, I think when we last saw you discuss this, what are the key areas on your risk register and what's changed?
So on our standard risk register, we haven't changed as a result of Brexit. So we have taken the impacts which are around the areas that we've discussed, the workforce issues, supply chain issues arising from border disruption, the impacts that we've been provided through some of the planning assumptions in terms of fuel and predominantly food, and work through those in greater detail. So in terms of the London risk register has not changed in its shape other than our ordinary work to look at drought, for example, and recent dry winters. We've changed the risk profiling on that, but as a result of Brexit, we haven't specifically changed the risk register.
But what we have been doing is developing the understanding of the risks facing London, specifically related to Brexit, as a sort of separate piece of work, and looking at the sort of impacts and risks which would broadly fall into two categories. So one is the maintenance of existing services and maintaining business as usual, and the other would be the response to incident or impact outside the control of any one agency. So all the different agencies such as the NHS would have their own plans, and the resilience forum would be looking at sort of what would happen if you have an incident that's outside the control of any one agency.
Okay, and obviously you've talked about the information from government and the lack of it. What about from businesses and organisations on the ground? Are they communicating with you freely? Are there issues there?
I think communication and concerns are being shared more freely than they were initially. I think Brexit is an issue that's highly weaponised, so I think you did see a reluctance for people to talk publicly. I think if you just look at the newspapers or listen to the radio or watch television at the moment, more and more organisations are coming out and being much more open about the concerns. They will have been likely to have been raising these concerns with government for some time. I think it's really focusing people's minds that actually we've got 44 days, it really isn't a long time. Some things it's almost too late to address, so sort of food labelling and over-labelling of food, which if we're not in the EU, we're not in a transitional period, what's going to happen with food labelling, for example, it is no longer food that will be made in the EU, so it kind of sort of starts complicating things. So I think that it's already too late for some people to actually sort of get appropriate labelling and things like that. So it's kind of people are being much more open about it now, but it would have been helpful if government had enabled that kind of open discussion. Before I mentioned earlier that the insistence that there was going to be a deal has not been helpful in terms of contingency planning, because some people have felt sort of confined, or because it's so weaponised as an issue that people speaking openly sometimes felt like they were entering into a political arena, which actually, as a general rule, we managed to keep contingency planning outside that political arena. We've tried as far as possible to keep politics out of it, and I think by and large succeeded as a LRF, but that sort of political dimension and the sort of highly contended idea of even whether no deal is as catastrophic as we would perceive it to potentially be, even that is disputed. So where you've got these disputed areas, it is not helpful for sort of open contingency planning and people to be able to be open about the risks they think they face. It is the uncertainty, I think, that is the biggest issue, and so for me, sort of having it right up to the wire is just going to exacerbate the potential for issues, because the lack of clarity. I spoke to a business owner who imports food from Scandinavia. She said that it was the lack of certainty that was preventing them actually having proper contingency plans in place for themselves, for their business. But she also said that even one day's delay in goods arriving would be fairly catastrophic for it would basically break their supply chain.
Yeah. No, it's interesting what you're saying, because you're right. It's even trying to talk practically about the impact of Brexit. You're seen as being political, and it's interesting the parties that turn up to our committee here now and those who just don't want to hear from you what the reality is on the ground in this area and the challenges perhaps that you're facing, with a small p. Political challenges, not capital P, but it is very difficult. It is very difficult, and nobody's wanted to raise their heads, I think, as you say, because if you do, I mean, the abuse we all get from daring to mention this subject is astonishing.
I mean, it is clearly changing, but I think the change has come about because people are quite clear that this is too late for people to have certainty about what's going to happen on the 29th of March. And while it looks like extending Article 50 might be an option, that is not an option that is a neutral option, because that will just prolong the uncertainty. It will potentially increase tensions, and so even it isn't as simple as it sounds or as straightforward as it sounds. It doesn't sort of provide a neutral solution to this impasse, as long as it isn't clear whether government is going to get a deal that is acceptable both to Parliament and to the EU. So I think the uncertainty people are feeling is just exacerbating people's ability to plan effectively.
Yeah. Can I just ask NHS colleagues, you set out some of the information that you collect daily from all your trusts and so on, and I used to work in a trust and I know all that micro management that goes on, but is there additional information that as a result of Brexit that you're planning to collect, and how are you going to use that?
So at the moment, and I'll refer to Peter in a second, at the moment there isn't. There have been discussions about whether we want to establish some sort of national collection to understand the pressures. That's not come down to us at a regional level as of yet, and I'm not sure whether there will be. What we are encouraging our services across London to do is to work within their geographies, within their borough and multi-borough geographies, to work through and understand whether they are experiencing any pressures or issues, and to then feed that through to us. But at the moment there isn't any nationally mandated or any regionally developed collection tools at the moment, bar our current dashboards that allow us to understand the operational performance of the service and any pressures that might occur.
But the advice is that be prepared that something might come, and be prepared to respond if it does.
I'm just thinking around, obviously you're going to give us some of the staffing workforce issues, but actually you're saying it's not that tricky. Well, it may not be, but on the other hand it could be. You could have a sudden exodus of staff, so presumably that might be some issue that you'd be looking at reporting on. What about drug supply, some of these other supplies you talked about? Are they things that you might then focus on?
So there's a very focused piece of work on supply of medications, as Kadir has already referred to, and a piece of work around monitoring supplies to ensure that they're not stockpiling. And I think that's more the point, is to make sure that the monitoring is picking up any areas where there might be stockpiling indicated to alleviate and make sure that that doesn't happen. So so there is additional monitoring that might come in there, and that's being done both regionally and nationally, but nothing else apart from that as far as I'm aware.
And the NHS collects data on vacancies and interim staffs on a routine basis anyway. So we have kind of a lot of the operational performance information for the service, as you will appreciate, is already in existence. So you can look at operational performance. We can look at the effectiveness of partnership arrangements in relation to service pathways. We can look at what vacancies look like, the levels of interims and agency staff being used, etc. So you can pick most of that up. The additional is, as Peter's highlighted, actually it's to pick up whether we're starting to see particular behaviours that may have then an adverse or unintended impact or consequence.
But these mechanisms are already in place, and they're not things that we're bringing in addition.
Thank you.
I'll just go back before I bring the others. On the stockpiling issue, I get the thing about medicines and about you can create consequences that will add to your problems later on, but also about the time limited issue. But what about other pieces of kit? Some of that may well be time limited, but doesn't it make sense to maybe stockpile some of that, or is that the same issues
message
of whatever? And then it only becomes a crisis if there is a complete collapse. That's the bit that you can't deal with, and then you have to manage that risk.
Exactly. So
the
the contingency at the moment is being planned across the NHS. Across the NHS is for 6 weeks. And so the expectation is that if there are supply chain issues and pressures, that they will be mitigated and resolved within those 6 weeks. And I think there's 3 bits to supply chain. There's medicines, there's then non-medical perishables, and then there's other suppliers.
It doesn't give us much hope that we've had 2 years to prepare for this, does it? In the sense of working where we are. But I suppose, when's a crisis a crisis? I felt that we're in crisis at the moment, rather than we could be even more of a crisis in no deal. But I do get your point around that. So you there. But surely that needs to be tested out and made clear to your counterpart civil servants that actually, if it all goes belly up, we've got 6 weeks to sort this out, and you need to make sure that the people above you and other decision makers really fully understand that. 6 weeks to resolve difficulties if it all goes terribly wrong. That's fair?
In relation to
give or take a week or two.
In relation to medicines, 6 weeks. 6 weeks.
So I just ask, what would it normally be? So you're saying you've got 6 weeks. What would normally be the sort of cycle? Is it 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
So, I mean, if you speak to the chief pharmacist for London, he will tell you that he will tell you that monitoring medical supplies and medicines is a BAU activity for the pharmaceutical for the pharmacist community in London. So you'll remember a few months ago there was a bit of a pressure around EpiPens, yeah, and he will tell you that we have got tried and tested processes in place that when there is a shortage or an issue around supply, we can put in place mitigations that make sure that those supplies are targeted to those most in need, that there's alternatives available, and then there's plans put in place to be able to accelerate supplies. So they will say to you that monitoring and management of supply chain in relation to medicines and other supplies is not something new that we are thinking about. It's a business as usual activity. It's only that perhaps more generalists like ourselves are interested in it at the moment because of the implications around Brexit.
But you're saying now you're allowing that there should be 6 weeks supply in the system.
Yes.
What is it generally now? I understand that you have to manage when there's a particular...
I don't know the answer to that.
I
so
couldn't answer that either.
But we can check.
I think that's an obvious thing, isn't it? Is it actually normally it's only 1 or 2 weeks and actually you're extending it? It's not stockpiling, but you're extending it. Or is it actually, is 6 weeks what it is now?
So I think it's the former. So I don't want to put a number on it, but I think what we are working to, like any other industry, is actually most of this is based on just in time, just into supply chain processes, and therefore what we're building in now is a contingency
with the suppliers and not with our own organisations. So
I understand you are not stockpiling. I get that, but basically. You've asked them to effectively hold 6 weeks' work.
Yes.
So that you have got a buffer.
Yes, exactly.
That's fine.
Caroline.
Yes. No, I just think a buffer. That's very perfectly put for this not stockpiling Yes. So continuing looking at contingency planning at the London level, and for all of you, just sort of following up a bit more on all the different information that you're all gathering and collecting, sort of how is that information that you're collecting being fed into the national operation, and what's it being used for? Is there anything that you haven't yet, I mean, obviously we've had quite a lot of information about data already, but is there anything that you haven't yet said about what the information you're collecting is being used for at the national level in terms of planning?
So from our perspective, in mid-January we started a reporting regime to central government on a weekly basis. So every Monday we provide a report to them on our expected impacts, any new risks that we're identifying, and what preparations we're putting into place so that they have an overview and can spot trends across the country. They're also running a series of exercises. So for the southeast of England, ours is on Friday, that we'll be attending with all of the other LRFs in the southeast of England. Following that, we're expecting a report back from central government. So far we haven't had an amalgamated picture back again. It's something that we continue to ask for, but I also understand from their perspective it's extremely difficult to interpret some of this data and provide it back. It's not numerical, it's more qualitative than quantitative, so it's very difficult to surmise and provide an overview picture back. We expect that to increase, so I think you may have seen in some of the media and the news that government is putting itself into a 24/7 operation. We expect that to be live from around about mid-March, so we will be upscaling some of our staff to meet that demand, because I anticipate that we will get an awful lot of questions coming back to interrogate the data, and we expect that new format. We haven't seen what questions or what the question will be asked yet, but we expect that to be at least daily from mid-March going forward for a period of, at the moment they're saying 12 weeks, and then it will slow down slightly for a further 12 weeks, but a period of 6 months altogether. We're expecting enhanced reporting to central government.
And one of the things Fiona mentioned earlier on was that one of the things that's unpredictable is how people behave. So in London, how Londoners are going to behave. It may be that the NHS is carefully not stockpiling and not doing any stockpiling, but I mean, all of us will have seen sort of social media posts or had people talking and having conversations about whether they're, people joke about their Brexit cupboard, and are you seeing any impacts from those kind of slightly random behaviours from people, from citizens, kind of beginning to have any kind of impacts on a sort of regional level, or is that all being coped with within the current? There's no, are there kind of impacts that are coming about because of the behaviour of people and their reaction to the uncertainty of the situation?
At present, no, but where those impacts would be felt would be in the private sector, and they would manage them as business would, and business needs would either meet the demand or respond accordingly. So nothing has been flagged to us as impacts. I think fairly sporadic at the moment, but may well continue to grow.
Yeah.
We just don't know. I think the public behaviour and how private industry, in particular food retailers, respond to that will be quite telling in this, how it pans out.
Because I think you've got a difference with people stocking up now and having, as you say, their Brexit cupboard, which I think is something that government might tell people not to do it, but the sooner government can actually give people some certainty that this isn't a prudent approach, the better. And actually what it throws up to me is really actually that there are people who can afford to do that and might be doing that. And I think some of the parenting websites have got the forums where there's long discussions about it and people sharing information about what they're sort of putting in their Brexit cupboard. But actually any kind of stockpiling is always going to mean that those people who can't afford to do that, and at the moment obviously we don't have a supply issue, so if people can afford to do it, if there are shortages there'll be a greater difference. I mean, it's an equalities issue basically, because people won't necessarily be able to afford it. And if stockpiling now turns into panic buying sort of near the date or just after the date, if there is a no deal, then that also, you get it's exacerbated by, can people afford to go and sort of buy up whatever, and you get some people who go and do it and are prepared, and you suddenly get a great unevenness. So I think that the government is right that stockpiling can cause issues. What isn't factored into any statement about that is human psychology, and I think that the longer the uncertainty, the less credible any message about not stockpiling from government will become. So this is an issue government needs to sort out. They need to get their act together so that people don't take what in some instances could be seen to be a very rational decision because of government's failure to provide that certainty that people need.
And just looking at the communities where there just is not the personal resource to be able to even buy one extra can of tomatoes each week, do we have a clear picture of how many households in London suffer food insecurity?
I think the Mayor's sort of the food strategy is commissioning a piece of work on the number of people who are currently in food insecurity. Our work would indicate that if you start getting an issue, you would get people who aren't currently identified by anybody or by themselves as being vulnerable, who could move into vulnerability because of the issues being presented by Brexit. So even if we had those figures now, which we don't, but which the Mayor is going to sort of work on through the implementation of the food strategy, you would see people who wouldn't normally be vulnerable actually sort of facing problems, particularly if you saw price rises in food as a result of shortages.
And the time scale to have that data to understand the scale of current food insecurity in London.
You'd need to talk to the food team here, but it's actually quite a major piece of work, and it's not something that anywhere in the country has actually done. So it's something that government has been asked to do in the past and not actually sort of carried through. But I think you'd quite often be looking at proxy indicators of food insecurity. So it is quite a major piece of work. I'm not sure what the timescale would be, but that's something we can ask the food team.
But it's something that's on your radar, that if there are food price rises,
we think
that's
that
something that you've identified as something that could need attention.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think that you're suddenly seeing, if there's a shortage, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to say that prices will rise, and the very least impact of food shortages would be price rises.
Thank you. Just before I move on, is there anything from the NHS perspective, just in terms of kind of London level data feeding up into the national picture that hasn't yet come out?
No, so nothing that we're picking up. I think, in relation to any potential implications from the impending decision.
Thank you.
Just
So,
before we move on that, in
yeah.
terms of servers, most of your IT servers, they're all based in the UK, aren't they? They're not external to EU, or are they?
It's a very good question, Jeff. So I have got an answer here in relation to there is something that we are doing in terms of making sure that all of our data, all of our information, data and analysis is being... Sorry.
no, go for it. Yeah, it's just jaw dropping. Yes, I hadn't even thought of.
No. There is a piece of work that every NHS organisation needs to just do to understand who provides its kind of IT infrastructure, where its data is stored, and to make sure that that meets the current regulations, but also there's no implications post exiting the EU, because if data is held offshore, because at the moment, as far as I understand, data can be held within the EU, and if it is, then we just need to think about the implications post exiting the EU.
And your current exercise is mapping that, or do we know where it all is, and we're just asking the specific agency or the operator of or the owner of the data to clean it and make sure
it's the latter. We're asking the individual NHS organisations to review how their data is managed and stored, and to make sure that that there isn't any implications for that going forward beyond.
If there is a no-deal Brexit, are there any? Is it clear what the what the regulations are around data that's not stored in the UK, or are there questions there that you need to clarify?
There is national guidance published by the government in relation to the implications for data regulations post exiting the EU, and I think essentially it's rolling over the current arrangements. So there has been national guidance published on that, which makes clear that there shouldn't be any imminent disruption to providers being able to continue to operate in the way that they are in relation to data capture and data storage.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
but yes, but long term, could there be changes if our data regulations, or would they just need to keep up and keep being changed to meet whatever the EU data regulations are in the future? Is that a long-term risk?
Without wanting to open another line of inquiry, I think it's a bit like procurement. So at the moment, the NHS, like anybody else in the UK, is obliged to comply with ODU, and the EU regulations in relation to procurement. The guidance that we've had post exiting the EU is that those arrangements essentially roll over. So we will apply the same rules and adhere to the same processes as we did previously, just without outside the requirements of EU regulations. And so it's the same principle. Much of our preparation, or much of the answers to the questions that we are asking, are essentially the current arrangements roll over.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes. So Fiona and John, just moving on to look at the potential of supply chain disruption in the event of any gridlock at ports of entry into the UK. Have you been able to kind of provide an assessment of the risks there?
So we've
or
worked
just the potential for any such disruption?
We've worked closely with Kent. Obviously, the biggest area of concern nationally is in Dover, in terms of the volume of traffic that comes through the Dover-Calais Straits, and the way in which it does in terms of such a cyclical route and a very short turnaround time. We also have the international ports within London itself, so we've been working closely with Heathrow and St Pancras in terms of the passenger movement and also the freight movement with Heathrow. City as well, yeah.
Port of London, presumably, as well.
So the Port of London, the actual docks sit just outside of London, and that's majoritively container ship access rather than ro-ro type ferry. So the container is easier because it tends to be on a longer turnaround time in terms of its freight, and therefore the manifesting and the customs checks can be taken over a longer period of time. It's more the instantaneous disembarkation of freight and onward movement where the delays to customs checks will create the delays. But there are also implications for individual passengers. If you go to an airport or any international port at the moment, all of the passport lanes are EU passport lanes. So to restructure, and anything that's been built within the last 20, 30 years is based on that. So there are a need for some infrastructural changes if there are to be changes in terms of the immigration policy and the passport checks put in place. So we have engaged with St Pancras in particular on that, and they've put in place a great deal of work and are confident that they can manage those passenger numbers and that they have good relationships with their customers to do so. Likewise with Heathrow, they have also put in place additional contingencies and upstaffing in terms of the ability to meet that demand over the immediate period. I think, like a number of the answers that we've had today, there may be small snapshots of what might be perceived as a crisis, but actually this is more about the adaptability of organisations, business and agencies to change, a kind of Darwinism approach as opposed to a purist business continuity. We will have to adapt into a new normal as opposed to trying to fight and stave off all the consequences to keep going how we used to.
Those kind of changes, it's like when they brought in all the liquids rules at airports. It took them several years to redesign the spaces so that there was somewhere to put your bag and put your belt back on and your shoes back on and not cause everyone else to back up behind you.
Yeah.
So are they, I mean, you say it's business continuity, have they got to rearrange, reconfigure spaces
potentially
to be able to...
And that's the crux, potentially, yes.
Okay, so it's just a question of how good they are at managing and organising their own logistics. So that's the ports of entry. Are there sort of road issues for London that might stem from any kind of gridlock at points of entry?
So the exercise that we're going to on Friday is going to look at this and what are the knock-on impacts, predominantly out of Kent, coming up. So that's a big part of it. We also have a meeting with Heathrow on Monday with Heathrow, TfL, MPS and the local boroughs to look at the potential knock-on of freight and Heathrow's equivalent of an operation stack should they have to back up the freight in terms of the customs processes. So something we're very aware of. At the moment we don't think it will be a huge impact on traffic. I can't foresee that the capital will gridlock any more than it does on a normal basis.
Yes, indeed.
And this is very much our difficulty in answering a number of questions back to government in terms of the impact is a true understanding of how the capital works day to day anyway and how it is managed through a number of organisations, each putting in place their own interventions and they're delivering their own statutory responsibilities just to make sure that London keeps running. But that's our main focus, is to make sure that London keeps running and that day-to-day business goes about its normal operations as far as it possibly can.
And there was the recent announcement from HMRC that they're going to wave trucks through at the borders if there's a problem with backing up. Does that also present risks for London, that you're just in terms of trucks not being checked?
Well, it doesn't change anything that we have in place at the moment in terms of trucks drive straight off. That there may well be opportunists. I think there's issues longer term in terms of how do the food standard agencies then put in place their checks going forward. I think customs checks on the whole are dip checks anyway. It's not a 100% of the goods going through a border are checked to a minute detail. So I think I read somewhere either today or yesterday that it is a low single figure percentage of goods that are actually checked by customs as they come through in the sheer volumes of what we bring through. So we will have to wait and see what the response is, and of course that's UK government's response that they will waive goods through. We are dependent on what EU mainland does as well, the other side, as to what the cycle will be, because if a ferry can unload, but if there's nothing to put back on it, it won't go across to bring goods back again. So there are a number of factors, and also depending on how swiftly organisations, hauliers and those that are importing and exporting can adjust to the new regimes of manifests and documents.
I mean, quite a lot of this is about agility, because we really don't know where an issue in the supply chain will come, because I think that there's a lack of understanding about supply chains anyway. And I think that if you look at the issue we had with CO2 last summer, which nobody had imagined a lack of CO2 would cause as significant issues as it did, then it is quite possible that the first issue that becomes a crisis is something that nobody has been able to envisage, because it's never been perceived as being an issue. So I think it's about that agility and the testing of plans, and the London Resilience Group is putting on a series of different scenarios just to test how people would respond if this particular issue or that particular issue arose. But the key to resilience in a situation where you actually don't necessarily know what the first issue is going to be is about sort of testing those relationships, testing the principles of coordination, and actually being agile enough to respond to whatever incident should arise.
Thank you. So finally, what advice are you giving the Mayor as to the work that he needs to prioritise to ensure that London is resilient to the possible shocks that might come out of a no-deal scenario?
I think the Mayor's already been taking quite an active role in addressing the potential of the impact of Brexit in London, and it was the Mayor who initially asked the London Resilience Forum to undertake the piece of work. I mean, I have, in terms of contingency planning, the Mayor's been quite proactive in relation to this, and I think that one of the main discussions I've had with him is around the work of the Brexit Contingency Planning Group, making sure he's aware of what's happening, aware of the issues. He's written himself to the Prime Minister, although, as John mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister has not chosen to write back to him. So John's also accompanied me to sort of give that sort of face-to-face advice to the Mayor at 2 of my recent regular meetings the Mayor has with myself and the London Fire Commissioner, and we've flagged issues as they've arisen and then sort of indicated sort of where we are and sort of what progress has been on the issue. So one part of my role in terms of the advice is around providing him with assurance, that the London Resilience Forum is undertaking the appropriate level of planning group, including, as I mentioned earlier, sort of having assurance that, as well as Brexit and anything that might present, the LRF is also able to respond to other issues. So I have discussed with him the lack of information we've had from government and how the individual views of ministers appears to be impacting on what kind of information we might be getting and what risks we think this presents. I've briefed him on potential issues in relation to some of the planning assumptions provided by government in relation particularly around food, which we identified as a particular risk, but also on fuel, and then we've also discussed sort of what kind of arrangements we might need to have in place internally.
Thank you.
It's fair to say on day 45, if we move towards no deal, Cobra will be in operation, and that will be giving a further lead to some of the issues and monitoring the ongoing situation that we face over this period of hopefully resolving issues or not resolving issues if they're still, or they will be unresolved. In a sense then, the respective players are coming together for their own bits of responsibility for resilience in London, whether it's NHS or not. Is there going to be a convening of all those people to share that at a strategic London-wide basis, if need be, to feed stuff back to Cobra, back to people to take decisions if people need help or not. There will be.
I think on a London level, I mean, this is the workshop that took place yesterday was looking at how that would work and looking at how the London arrangements would feed in both to government, and you mentioned Cobra, but also sort of how organisations would feed into that. And I think John and his team will be working on a structural diagram just to make sure people understand how it works, because it's not the same arrangements as people are used to, because you have that additional there that we're not necessarily putting arrangements in place for a specific incident. This is for a sort of potentially a whole range of different incidents, and so we need to be agile with our normal arrangements while still making sure that we've got very clear structures in place so that people understand the role of different meetings, who should be at those meetings, what kind of level of discussion should be, and how that then feeds into national discussions.
And the role, we've had experience of this before. I'm going to refer to the incident, but the intervention, if one of the partners starts to fall down or a collapse in the system in one part versus the other, we're not going to see a repeat of people standing off because of what lack of protocols that allow intervention or help to be given to those that, quite frankly, maybe be overwhelmed by a problem. Whether it's a mass crisis in the social care system or something is going wrong, there will be a different level of intervention than maybe that we saw in the immediate aftermath of Glenfell.
And I think John might have comments on this as well, but I think that the London councils and the local authorities panel did a lot of work looking at what went wrong. There's a lot of work going on through the Resilience Forum on making sure that lessons are both learned and implemented, so we're trying to shift that forward. But going back to my point about the politics of the situation, one of the unique things about this situation is the overlay of politics and actually sort of quite immovable views in some instances. And if we do get to the situation where we do have no deal and issues do start arising, we do need to make sure that people set aside any political lens and actually sort of see it as the crisis it could potentially be. But I think in terms of lessons learned and implemented, I think there's an awful lot of work that's been going on.
Now let's return. So the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government have announced they're giving London councils around 7 million, of which we get, so most of my constituencies is a large sum. It does seem rather small. The GLA will receive 182,000. So what will that be spent on, and how will that be spent? It's over 2 years, I understand that. What's the initial priorities for that?
Yeah, I mean, do you want to comment on this? Because we've had some discussion about this.
Yeah, so that funding is over 2 years. We also, as an LRF, received just over 76,000 as well, and the auspices of that was to deal with the additional reporting. So we are putting in place additional staff to meet that demand, because, as Deputy Mayor said earlier, we also have to maintain our day job of being ready for any incident that happens in London. So I cannot utilise the whole team on Brexit. I think also if we look at a 6-month period, there will be an awful lot of fatigue. I mean, there already is in the uncertainty. It's quite emotionally draining as a subject with the uncertainty and the chopping and changing. So we are looking to bring in additional staff to give us that headroom for the reporting demand. And the piece that you were just talking about, the coordination arrangements, that's looking like we will be reporting every day, 7 days a week, over the first initial perhaps month, which in itself takes quite a demand in terms of the preparation, the reporting, turning that around and answering any specific questions for government. So that's where the majority of the money for us. And I think also the GLA will go in the first instances to make sure that we have the right staff for the immediacy and to deal with any crises.
And what do we think our colleagues in local government will be spending their money on?
That's up to them. in terms of they are going through a similar demand of reporting, so they are producing at present a weekly local government reporting, and they've consolidated that into one London report led by London councils. So there is work going on there, and then it will be as each organisation sees fit. So every London local authority now has a SPOC, a single point of contact, and that's been majoritatively taken away from resilience areas and into a greater oversight of the organisation and a policy world, as I've been informed. So I think the work needs to go in there as to adapting the agility of an organisation in order to support the changes in policy that they'll have to take.
I don't want to lose sight of this. I want to follow up and see where they're spending the money and how they're spending it. So we'll try and do it at this end. Without they share it as good practice. Now, you in the NHS, were you given any pots of money to help you in this preparation? Have you been told to just deal with it within your budgets? Is there any health pots that have been given to you?
The national colleagues have allocated a small amount to every region in order to, as our LRF colleagues have said, we need to make sure that we maintain a level of resilience in our emergency planning, resilience and response teams, so that if there is any other incident or issue that arises, we've got capacity and capability. So we, like our LRF colleagues, have established some additional staff in order to augment Peter's current team to be able to manage some of the surveillance and reporting that might be required and planning that might be required in this. We're also working with some of our staff to think about what's prioritised, and therefore is there areas of work that we can potentially deprioritise in order to free staff up to support.
And is there a figure that you can give us of what you've been given to London? What were you being given?
Our national colleagues have allocated somewhere in the region of I think it's around £500,000 to plan and prepare for London.
Okay. I'll leave that question. Let's move on just in terms of specifics. And if we can go back to just in terms of the food supply issue, because it's clear on no deal it's more difficult. It's about delays and sort of while issues are resolved. Are we aware, because I know you have an relationship with the private sector now as they gear up in terms of the different sectors, of their stockpiling of foodstuffs, or have they given any indication of that? Whether any of the stores or any of the larger food manufacturers have been stockpiling or looking into that?
There's been stories around biscuit companies sort of supplying raw materials, but the issue is that if government is clear that it is fresh food that is likely to be in short supply, then there's a limit to what people could actually stockpile usefully at this stage. But I think the other thing would be that where there are things that people think will be in short supply, it's always going to be the bigger companies that would be better able to do this, whereas some of the smaller companies might struggle. And if you look at proxies, you can see what the impact of a loss of supply was on Borough Market. I think there's a real issue potentially around some of the smaller businesses struggling if you get a delay of and a sort of loss of goods and an inability to trade for any sort of length of time.
Okay, all right then. Let's move on then to the next. I can't remember which account.
I think the NHS.
It's you,
Yes, sorry, I just missed that little bit. In terms of NHS, we've sort of talked about this a little bit already, the likely risk to access to medicines and medical supplies. You're saying you've got this 6 weeks, I'm going to call it a buffer, not a stockpile, but you've got that there. That gives you the confidence that there won't be any risk.
Based on the national scenario planning and all the assumptions that have been taken into account, we're confident that 6 weeks. So 6 weeks buffer, 6 weeks of national reserves agreed across the department with our pharmaceutical suppliers are sufficient in order to manage and mitigate any supply chain issues during the immediate after math. That sounds slightly damning.
It does sound damning.
During the immediate after of exiting the EU.
Well, can I give you a specific? I raised this back in October. I raised this with the Mayor. How withdrawing from Euratom would have a huge impact on cancer treatments, because, not that I am an expert in this area, but medical radioisotopes can't be stockpiled, not that you're stockpiling, but they can't be in any case because they decay quickly. What are you doing in that particular area, very specific area, of very short life cancer treatments, to make sure that patients in London have access to their ongoing treatment?
Okay, so I'm hoping Peter's got the detailed answer to that in front of him at the moment.
So we've got some specialist providers in London, and the Department of Health and Social Security are aware of those, and they've been engaging with the suppliers of the radioisotopes in question, and they've received good engagement with those suppliers across the industry, with the aim of ensuring that those suppliers are able to continue, so making sure that they've mapped out any touch points for those radioisotopes across Europe, and that the suppliers have got adequate business continuity arrangements to ensure continued supply if there are any interruptions after the 29th of March.
The bit to add to this is that where there's supply chain issues or delays in the supply chain due to the bottleneck essentially may occur, there will be other routes into the UK, be them by sea or by air, and the commitment that we've had from government and from the Department of Health is that medicines and medical supplies would be prioritised in those circumstances. So in relation to isotopes, for example, if that becomes an issue due to the bottleneck, there will be other routes, and those routes, medical supplies for those routes will be prioritised. Does that make sense?
Yes, you've got a protected route that no matter what, you can get these drugs and isotopes in from other European countries. Because I understand some of them are made in places like the Netherlands. We don't make them all here, some specialists. So you've got to make sure patients are guaranteed to continue their treatment.
That's right, and so the commitment that we've had is that other routes into the country would be protected, and these kind of supplies would be prioritised if we saw pressure on them.
Are there any other?
Sorry, but there must be a cost to that. That's not cost neutral, is it?
No, I presume that.
I just want to get. I'm a bit obsessed with costs. I just want to try and get a track of this, because they can't be cost neutral or doing something different than what you're doing now.
I'm sure, but I think that I'm sure I don't have the answer to that, and I imagine the answer to that would have to be from the department, because I presume the department would have to bear the additional costs for that.
Would it be the department rather than the individual hospital trust picking that up?
I presume the additional cost would be borne by the department.
Well, it's that they've chartered some special places that have got aircraft rather than places that don't have the right ships or no ships.
I'm working on the basis that they have.
Are there any other particular medicines or treatments that you are having to put particular arrangements in place that we haven't mentioned this morning, or that your areas that are slightly more unusual medicines or rare that you're more concerned about?
So the department have identified a list of priority medicines that I don't have that list in front of me, but there's a list of priority medicines that have already been identified, and that has been then those additional supplies have been negotiated between the department and the pharmaceuticals concerned in order to make sure that contingency is available. So there's a national list, and I think it is.
Is that longer than the 6 weeks for those particular drugs?
No, it's those drugs, but I think that list is public, and if it's not, then perhaps we can see whether we can share that with you. But there is a national list of medicines to be prioritised.
Okay, but there's no particular medicine or treatment that you're concerned about?
Not that I'm aware of or concerned of.
Well, we've asked all providers to undertake a thorough analysis of what they use, and
Yes.
if there are any issues, then to raise it through us, and we can raise it through national. But as far as I'm aware, in London, we haven't had anything apart from the radioisotope question.
Yes. Okay, thank you. And I know the London Ambulance Service has added Brexit to its risk register as a red alert because they're very concerned about the workforce. Is this something you're seeing across the NHS, people putting this as a red alert?
So we're asking all organisations to review their business continuity and to their risk registers in order to make sure that they are thinking about and planning for. And so that would include the London Ambulance Service. And so that would be our expectation.
We're not encouraging organisations to put Brexit on as an additional risk, because I think, as John has said, it's picking up the implications, the impacts of Brexit within their current business continuity and risks.
The LAS, I think they're particularly concerned about access to fuel.
Yeah.
Stockpiling spare parts, I presume that means for their ambulances,
Yes.
and fleet, and impact on their workforce. So that's why they have particularly flagged it.
Yes, and other organisations may have specific issues that they've put onto their risk registers, but so absolutely in the right process, London Ambulance Service have identified those as specific areas for them to focus their business continuity arrangements around.
Okay, thank you.
And you've picked up on the fuel issue, haven't you, generally?
I don't think, did you want to comment specifically on that, because you've done quite a lot of work on it, John?
So the fuel issue, it was raised as a planning assumption to us on the second iteration. We've subsequently had further conversations, and this is what I referred to earlier when I said, we're given the answer, we're given what the planning assumption is as a statement. Actually, we needed the grown-up two-way conversation with government to understand how that manifests. And the manifest of fuel disruption was around disruption to traffic, so it will be hardest hit probably down in the southeast of England, which may lead to very localised shortages, which then is exacerbated by public behaviours. So the risk to fuel is not that there won't be sufficient supply, it's not that the supply chain has broken down in any way, shape or form, it is the public behaviours that could exacerbate a just enough, just in time provision to the public, which it takes 2 days to run the system down, but 7 days to fill it back up again. So that's where we'll see the problems, is very localised fuel forecourts run out all of the time, but if it happens around the period of the 29th, 30th, 31st, people will treat it in a different way, and we could see the public rushing out to buy fuel.
Caroline?
Yes, just picking up more on the London Ambulance Service. The Peace in the Evening Standard also said there had been discussions with the military to establish support if required in the event of political unrest. So I just wonder, in the light of that and all the things that Caroline has just raised, can you tell us any more about the discussions that you're having with the emergency services to ensure that they are ready for every eventuality if there's a no-deal Brexit? I don't know whether that's NHS or John.
So I can go first. In terms of both the military and the LAS are represented on the Brexit contingency planning group, and that hasn't arisen with those two groups. So I think we have to be very careful how this was reported, and the article in front says discussions with the military should be undertaken to establish support if required in the event of political unrest.
Okay,
so there's a very fine
okay.
difference, and I think that goes back to support that we've had previously around strikes and utilising prior contingency plans should the support be taken. So we're not aware of that conversation actually taking place. It is a thought process to go through if required.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have anything to add to John's.
Okay, well, in which case, I just want to ask each of you, what are your priorities for the next few weeks? I don't know which end you want to start.
I'd like to start with the LRF and work down.
I'll start. So our priority really continues on the engagement with government and in particular the work around what our reporting arrangements are, C3, what we call the command coordination communications arrangements, following on from the workshop yesterday, to detail out the exact terms of reference to finalise the strategy that we have as an agreed draft working strategy, and look at the real practical arrangements of where we'll be sat, where we host meetings on a daily basis, and bring in staff to ensure that we can meet that demand.
It's a nice short list. Good luck.
Yeah, I think my priority is, and I thought I mentioned it before, but it is to make sure that we have the appropriate level of strategic coordination in relation to Brexit, that we're agile in response, that we meet the reporting demands, that we work as closely as we can with government and with partners, but also that we can have that assurance that if and when something else, and I think we need to be realistic about sort of level of likelihood of something else happening in London at the same time as any Brexit related issues, that we can actually deliver that strategic coordination for both. And I think that's a challenge, but it also has to be the priority.
Thank you.
3 from me, making sure that we've got the right partnerships across London, so the NHS is playing its part and making sure it's demonstrating its readiness. That we've got the people in place within the service, so at a regional level within the NHS England London regional team, we've got the team stood up and operational, and the final bit is making sure that the patients and public are that any concerns or issues that they have are allayed and are responded to where they exist.
Well, look, can I, sorry, Dimitri, do you want to add anything?
Very similarly to Kadir's, just to make sure that we're in a position where we're ready to protect the public going forward in terms of making sure the patient gets continued service.
Lots of P's from the NHS. Everything begins with P. Alliterative.
Well, thank you for the way that you've answered our questions. We go away and we're going to deliberate on some of your answers. I think we will come back to you around costs and preparations, like different for you in the forum, but we think it may be worthy of debate because I think it's quite important to understand that and for people to understand this. And I realise we are planning on the worst case scenario, but I think whatever happens in 45 days' time is going to be a bit chaotic till things settle down, but even more chaotic if there's no deal. So we wish you well in the preparations you do. There's a lot that is, a lot of Londoners are relying on you to get it right, and there will be problems, we know that, it won't all run perfectly, but I think some of the work that you're doing now is obviously going to pay some dividends for this, albeit I understand that you're working within a not in the most unique, not in the best possible way in terms of planning for these challenges. So thank you for that. So we'll come back to you. We probably will write to you. If there's anything you feel that you want to share with us, if there is, we do have our website. We're more than happy. If there's stuff that's public you want to try and give an airing on our website, then let's do that. I think you're already covered. But in terms of the NHS, if you want to share those issues around the medicine list, just to reassure the public that you've got this in hand, then I think we're welcome to host it.
Certainly some of the comms we'd be really keen to make sure that we're getting out of
spread it. I think so. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now this is where we have a slight introduction for our next stage of our next guest who's going to come before us, which is Jamie Izzard, who's a member of the LEAP team here in the GLA. As I'm scrambling to think what the acronym is, sort of just remind me. The LEAP, is the local London Economic Action Partnership. Well, Jamie, we got that bit right. So.
I never know what it stands for. It's a left.
I was just googling it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's London's left.
Yep.
I thought we confused things with a new acronym.
Yeah, they added the A in and then it's thrown everyone.
Don't worry, we'll give you a couple of months and no doubt post-Brexit it'll be changed.
Jamie's name.
Jamie, just want to put that in front of you. Thank you for being patient in waiting for your turn. We've just got a set of questions because obviously there is work and that work is no doubt changes the closer we get to Brexit in some form or another. So can you just update us on the work that has been going on by the LEAP to prepare sort of London businesses for Brexit?
Sure. So the main initiative we've got live at the moment is the London Brexit Business Resource Hub, which the Mayor launched at his business reception last year. And the idea of that was to bring together some of the online resources that are available from government and others, and then supplement that with some additional content that we thought is needed in terms of making it nice and simple for businesses, particularly micro businesses, to understand what the issues are they need to be considering and what the current situation is. So that online hub is live at the moment. It was a recommendation from the London Business Board, so a coalition of business bodies in London felt that was a priority for them. It also came out of the Brexit survey that we conducted in City Hall with businesses to understand what they needed from us. So that's the first step, and that's live at the moment. We're building further content on there as we go along. And as of today, we've appointed a delivery partner for some face-to-face support for London businesses. So the plan is to work with an organisation to deliver training to at least 1,500 SMEs through masterclasses and workshops of between 3 and 5 hours, taking a general SME approach and then looking specifically at key sectors that face particular challenges. We've yet to agree what that list is, but we know that the creative sector in particular and food and drink, as you've heard earlier, are ones that we're particularly keen to focus on. So we're delivered across 75 events. We're keen to make sure they happen all across London, so they're not all just here at City Hall. So we've mandated it would be across around 20 boroughs. And we're looking to work with local authorities to host those events with us, so they won't be done in isolation. And then as part of that project, we'll also be rolling out additional resources for the online portal, some more fact sheets, Q&As, podcasts, webinars. So a lot of the content will be filmed, so businesses that can't attend the events will be able to access the content. I mean, I think we're able to reach about 0.15% of London's SMEs through the actual events. So the online offer is really important, and raising awareness that offers there is key. The other thing we've been doing is as a board, so our business deputy chair, Angus Knowles-Cutler, who leads from a business perspective on the LEAP, takes an active role across the LEAP network, working with other LEPs to work together on particular issues, cross LEP boundaries, but also to speak to government. And Angus recently attended a meeting with the PM alongside other LEP chairs, where he led on a discussion around some of the issues that businesses across the country are facing, but the intelligence that we've been gathering from the LEPs and our networks. It's probably worth mentioning that government are taking the feedback they get from LEPs and the LEP growth hubs as key information in terms of business intelligence. So the information that we're providing, and they ask us to do a return on a weekly basis. We don't always have intelligence to give them, but on a weekly basis we're feeding into government, and that's going through and sort of informing ministers' briefings, etc.
Okay, can I just, in terms of the type of organisation that you're seeking to commission to do this with, there can't be many that can undertake that level of activities, or am I mean, without naming names of companies or anything like that, or of people, what are we talking about? Academia? Are we talking about universities? Are we talking about other institutions? I'm just trying to think of the size, because that's quite sizable in terms of the ask that you're going to be commissioning to them. So can you just give us a flavour of that, of what your thinking process is?
Well, I mean, the organisation, as I say, I won't say too much more because we haven't signed a contract with them yet. But they're a London-based company, been running for over 15 years, fairly small central team, but the idea, and with expertise, particularly in EU law and experience in that area, and then partnering with a range of individuals who will deliver the training on their behalf. So, for example, there's one individual that we have signed up to the programme who has previously done work for the FSB, so has been doing a lot of their Brexit-facing, EU-facing activity on behalf of the FSB. So, it's a partnership approach.
And in your work, of course it's right to include local government, but across London there are various chambers of commerce that are different levels. There are some that are really providing services to their members and others. Are they going to be included in some of these discussions where it's appropriate? I'm thinking particularly in my patch in South East London. So I think it's a slightly different I'm not saying it's consistent across London, but where they're established and I've got a proven record, you'd be working with them or not?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, South East London's a good example. The chamber there, particularly strong. Hounslow, a couple of we worked with before. Will certainly be some of the partners we'll be approaching to help us host these events and obviously to raise awareness. The chambers have been identified already.
So in our links with central government, have we got a number of asks that we're asking of them over, not just in the run-up to Brexit, but maybe post-Brexit, about some of what we think are our needs? Is there, if I asked you, is that list available and can we have a look at it? Is there some list that the LEAP have discussed or, have got some validation from its various partners and networks that have contributed to that?
It's interesting, actually. I think the London Chamber have actually pulled together, it's not asks, but it's 23 questions, I think. Questions that remain unanswered. So this is about certainty and further information. And that's something we'd absolutely support. So they're all the issues that remain outstanding. So clarity is the number one issue. From the feedback we get from businesses, we need that certainty. Government have made some steps. So in certain areas they've provided guidance, which is helpful. They've provided an online tool for small businesses to go through and identify what the issues may be for them. But to be frank, it may be quite nice at the front end, but actually it's going to spew out 40 different documents and much which is technical. So I think there's a role to play locally to simplify all of that content that government's providing, and it's just businesses drowning and they turn off, particularly micro businesses.
And of course, we talked a little bit, touched on this earlier, about that whatever happens on day 45, there's still going to be a little bit of uncertainty. It's still not completely au fait with the rules and the engagements that we're in, even with a no-deal scenario for some of our businesses. Of course, if we work towards no deal, the nature of your work changes even more so. What's the current thinking of that, and what's the discussion that the LEAP have been having around that, or internally what the officers supporting the LEAP are thinking around that issue?
Yeah, I mean, what we're doing at the moment is trying to equip businesses to be thinking about the issues should a no-deal situation arise. Some of the things they can do right now, and there's some basic steps, particularly around international trade, and there's some work we need to do around DPA, etc. So there's some work we're doing to prepare them in that area. I think for me, the priority will be, if we're in that situation, to provide much more bespoke support to businesses. So having 75 events may not be what we need if we're in a no-deal scenario. So we have some funding outlined for the next 2 years. And we would put to the LEAP that we should reprioritise some of that funding to provide more one-to-one support to businesses and really step up the capacity.
And what sort of, if I can describe it as a war chest, what sort of funding is that available to you over that period of time? Not so what you're doing now, but what you could potentially reprofile.
Yeah, I mean, specifically there's a fund of several £100,000 which we have available at the moment. We're developing ideas for different programmes that we could use, so through the London Growth Hub. So looking at plans for how we would use that. Do we focus it on digital upskilling, for example, hosting some roundtables to develop that further. But should that situation arise, then we would be reconsidering how we use that money.
Can I just ask on that, the work you're doing in that area, did a paper go to the LEAP to decide on this programme and the expenditure?
The existing expenditure.
And what you're planning, what you've just been talking about, the road share and the money.
Yeah, so the plans we have at the moment, so the Growth Hub goes to the LEAP Investment Committee, for example, so under delegations.
Paper available? Is it publicly available?
Yeah. It should be published, so I can double check.
Yeah, I just wonder whether you could just flag that for us.
Sure. We do sort of business cases for each of the submissions that we do for.
Yeah, so it might be useful just to get some of the detail and your thinking behind it, please. Sorry,
No, that's fine. That's quite important. And I suppose the last one. So a lot of a lot of some of the discussions around London's needs in the different sectors. Some of the sectors are very well and capable, able to look after their own. I'm thinking of the financial sector. We've had certainly engagement with the insurance sector, which is going to be impacted. When we talked about micro businesses and some of their issues and those, is a real challenge, I think, for anybody in normal circumstances about engagement for that. And I think one of the issues is that is there a desire, I think it's a mayoral desire, that we start looking at this sector and how would we do that? And what's the thinking of the LEAP about that? Because I know that I think I've seen some work that you're interested in doing, but it is challenging, isn't it, reaching out to this sector. It's its own sector, but it is unorganised as such. There may well be part of business groupings, but it's very unorganised.
We're trying to keep afloat, most of them.
They may be organised in their own business, but
collectively
they're not
as
organised.
Collectively,
just
as a
to
voice.
be clear.
Yeah, sorry, thank you very much for that. That's what I meant to say.
Right.
But in terms of engagement, what's your thinking around that?
Yeah, it's really tricky because we can access FSB members and chamber members, etc. But that doesn't cover everybody, and particularly the smaller end of micro business, so the sole traders. What we do, we try and raise awareness of what we do as much as possible. So we go around and do things like local business shows. So we was at one yesterday, and just raising awareness of what the LEAP's doing, and particularly the Brexit Hub and the programme that we'll be doing. Working with economic development teams and heads of regen in the boroughs is key, because they will each have quite significant business databases. So making sure we're in their newsletters, that kind of just basic on the ground stuff, building those networks. But you're right, I mean, we put some survey questions out to small businesses, and they're completely fatigued about these surveys. When we meet with them face to face, if we ask them what the issues they're worrying about Brexit, they say, just want certainty. We just want to survive. We don't know. But there is, there's been some useful. It's anecdotal, but some of the issues that they've been coming out is around rising costs already. So one business we spoke to was talking about 37% rise in manufacturing costs for them. Many others are talking about not pursuing growth in their businesses, so if they're not looking at new markets, because now is just not the time to start thinking about trading with the EU if they're not really doing that. So there's a real impact on their growth capacity and appetite. And then there's some more practical issues, like we've been speaking to very small sort of pharmaceutical companies, one based in North Kensington, and they're really concerned about access to some of the cross-EU work they currently have, so not just supply chains, but also how they have access to clinical trials that happen across Europe and things like that. So there's anecdotal stuff, but what we need to do is use those networks to reach a much wider audience.
Okay. Other questions? Any?
I think it's covered. I mean, I'm just really, it was very reassuring to hear the way you're reaching out to the micro businesses, because those local authority networks are really a good way of getting to them. And I do think they are the group that are most at risk of being, they're the ones who found it hardest to engage with the information that's come from government, right, and to translate it into anything that's meaningful for them. So if that piece of work is going on, that's reassuring.
One extra question we'd written down was about how you're really targeting those micro businesses and small businesses. And I like the idea of that one-to-one, because everyone's issues, like that pharmaceutical example you've given, is so unique, but that's a real problem for them. So actually being able to, if you're able to have those experts giving that advice around London, I think that sounds really positive.
There's certainly been a priority for me in that situation, and we'll mobilise it as soon as we can.
And I suppose the issue is how those micro businesses are engaged with in the event that any of the scenarios that are being actively kind of worked to mitigate in the previous session, if there are difficulties with access to fuel or access to goods and things that they might be selling in their shops, just what kind of communication and support is there for that group of businesses, because they will be less likely to be caught up in sort of organised networks of information sharing and support. So it's sort of just making sure that they are within your thinking in terms of resilience and ongoing dealing with any fallout, if there is any, sort of after the 29th of March.
Particularly in terms of the food and drink sector, for example, many SMEs operate in that market that could find their fundamental principles of trading disabilities.
Well, can I thank you for the way you've answered our questions? If you can supply us with that information on your Venture Investment Board, we'll again reflect carefully on what you've asked us. We may come back and ask you more questions. And I think we should try and timetable you in for a future meeting to see how things are going and what other things you're picking up. So we'll do that. Thank you very much. Thank you. So if we just do the formal business, I think can we note the various reports and the discussions that we've had on the various items. Delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree an output from this discussion.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Then we need to deal with 7 date of next meeting. We've got a scheduled date. I think we're going to re-look at this date on June, considering matters in other places. So we might bring it forward. That's item 7. Item 8, any other business? There is none. I declare this meeting closed. Thank you.
Well done, thank you.
Very interesting.
GLA, Committee Room 4,